Hello, I'm Canon Blair Schultz, and this is History and Use of the Book of Common Prayer. This is the second time I've taught this course, and but the first time I've ever taught a course on to load to YouTube. So we'll see how that's going to work. I know it works fine for Father Russell. Hopefully, it'll work fine for me too. As I said, I'm Canon Blair Schultz. I'm canon to the ordinary of the Diocese of the Atlantic States. In other words, I'm Bishop Upham's canon. When you see me looking around, I'm either looking at my notes, which is be looking down here, but we also have a security system. So up in this corner here, I can see the videos, cameras from the front door and the back door. So if you see me looking away, why that's why I'm doing that. Also, my dog Toby is here, so he might make some noise from time to time, and but anyway, he shouldn't be too much of a bother. Give you a little bit of background. I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Monmouth College here in Monmouth, Illinois. I have a Master of Science in Forensic Science degree from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I have a Bachelor's of Sacred Theology from St. Joseph of Arimathea Anglican Theological College in Berkeley. For 30 years, I was a forensic scientist with the Illinois State Police, and then I took an early retirement and went to seminary and was ordained a priest in 2006. I've been a deacon since 1998, I think it is. I'm the rector of All Saints Anglican Church in Bolingbrook, Illinois, and I've been the rector since 2008. I'm one of the founding members of the parish, and I remember the first meeting we ever had. There were three of us at that meeting, and from those three people, why we've grown to a parish of about 120 people with the kids and everything. We own our own building and we have no mortgage. So from 1996 until now, we've done very well. We've been blessed. I'm chairman of the Diocese of the Atlantic States Standing Committee, and I'm also a member of the Diocese of the Atlantic States Board of Examining Chaplains. And for the most part, I'm the one who writes the tests for the diaconate and the priesthood in the Diocese of the Atlantic States. This is the second time I've taught this course. If you have any questions about anything that has to do with the course, my email is bw.schultz@sbcglobal.net. I think all of you have received an email from me, so you should have my email. You can call me on my cell phone. It's 630-373-0201. But I would appreciate you sending emails, unless it's something very urgent. The YouTube channel is Schultz APCK, and hopefully you had no problems signing on to that. Okay. Oh, one other thing, you might see in the background some reflections of light or that sort of thing. I have the drapes open in my office, and when cars go by, why they, make you can see the reflection of the sun off the cars in the back wall there. Okay. By now you should have received 5 handouts by email, and those are the class schedule. And the first time I did this class, I started in January and finished, I think, in May. There's basically 15 sessions, but Bishop Upham wanted me to start this semester, and so we decided we would divide this class into two different semesters. And so this is the first semester class, excuse me, which will run from September 28th to November 16th. So we'll be finished with the class before Thanksgiving, and then you'll be given a final for the first semester, and then get that done before Christmas. The second semester will start in February and go through March 22nd. And if I've gotten my dates correctly, so we will finish before Holy Week. Again, then there'll be a final. And I notice right now on the class schedule I put the final being May 29th. That's probably going to be well, let me take a quick look on my calendar here. Of course, nothing ever goes fast when you want it to. Oh, there we go, 29th. Let's make it April 2nd. So instead of that May 29th, it'll be April 2nd, unless something changes between now and then. But anyway, this is, while it's 2 semesters, it is 1 class. And so if you say to somebody, oh, what a great class, Canon Schultz is teaching, why then you should take it. They're going to have to wait for the next time the class is given. So anyway, you've gotten your class schedule, and you'll see tonight's is introduction, and we'll start on the history of the prayer book. Let's see. Okay, your second handout is a reading list, and you can thank Father Russell for this particular reading list, because it's 4 pages of different books that have to do with the history and the use of the Book of Common Prayer. I believe, all of these books. I have not, however, read all of these books. So, and some of them, frankly, aren't the kind of book that you would just pick up and start reading from cover to cover. They're more reference books, and you would pick them up and see about one specific topic. I've divided this into just a bibliography on the prayer book, and a bibliography on literature, and then another bibliography that I'm just calling other. It's kind of arbitrary what goes into which section. And I was looking at this the other day, and I thought I should have put a book called Archbishop Cranmer's Immortal Bequest into the prayer book section, not into the liturgy section. But, it isn't going to make any difference in the long run. The next handout is called A Selective Outline of the History of the Church of England. I'm not going to go through all of this, because this is not a course on the history of the Church of England. But we will go over some of it, and specifically the parts that have to do with the prayer book and how it was written and why it was written, and that sort of a thing. You might, however, want to read all of it, and not so much commit it to your memory as just to give you, in your own mind, an outline of the history of the Church of England, because you might be asked that in a canonical exam, either written or oral. And as my as the one of the coaches in high school used to say, a word to the wise should be sufficient. The next handout is called A Brief History of the Book of Common Prayer. This was actually the basis of a sermon that I gave in, I believe it's 1999, on the occasion of the 550th anniversary of the first Book of Common Prayer. Again, I'm not going to go over everything, but again, you might be interested, and I think you would be interested to read over what it says, but we will go over that. And then the final handout that you should have gotten at this point is a chart from the a magazine called Mandate, which has an outline of where the Book of Common Prayer came from, and how the different books of Common Prayer connect together, and what are some of the sources. Again, well, this I find this interesting. I think you'll see it's interesting to see where the different where the prayer book came from. This chart, excuse me, this chart is also in Shepherd's book, and Shepherd's book, and in fact, I think that's probably where they got it from. Speaking of Shepherd's book, well, I'll get to that in a little bit here. As the class goes on, you'll get other handouts. I'm not sending them all out to you to begin with. I don't want to overwhelm you. I'll send them by email, and you can decide whether you want to print them out or not. Each handout has a number to it, from 1 to, I'm not sure remember what the last number is at this point. That's to help me to make sure that I remember to send them out and in what order to send them out. If I didn't have them numbered, why then they'd be in there by alphabetical order, and I couldn't. That would be very confusing to me. Oh, I got to get one of my books. Well, you've seen my secret. I'm wearing jeans and not not black slacks today. You weren't supposed to see that, but then anyway, that's the way things are. I'm recording this on Monday, which is technically my day off, so I thought I'd be comfortable. All right, the purpose of the class. T.S. Eliot, in the book The Ideal of the Christian Society, wrote, "The purpose of reascending to origins is that we should be able to return with greater spiritual knowledge to our own situation." The idea here is, in simpler words, I think, is you'll have a better appreciation of the Book of Common Prayer once you know where it came from and its sources and its origins. I also put in here a quote from Frederick Denison Maurice. "I hope you will never hear from me any such phrase as our excellent or incomparable liturgy. I do not think we are here to praise the liturgy, but to use it." You can praise the liturgy if you want to, and if you're taking this course, Toby is trying to get in some trash. But the real purpose of the prayer book is to use, and it can be used in almost every occasion that has something to do with religion. With that in mind, we're supposed to use the liturgy. That's part of the reason why the course is being taught, so give you a better idea how to use the liturgy. We'll also give you some history of the Book of Common Prayer. I'm going to tell you how to worship and conduct services according to the Book of Common Prayer. One of the things I think is really important is that, and I'm going to explain the differences between the Book of Common Prayer and the missals. There's nothing wrong with using the missals. They're specifically mentioned in canon law, provincial canon law. But I think it's important, if you follow the missals, you know how they differ from the Book of Common Prayer. And if you're asked, well, why are you doing it this way instead of this way? Because this is what the Book of Common Prayer says, or this is what the missals say. You'll know why you're doing what it is that you're doing. I've had the feeling at some parishes that what's being done is being done because that's the way we've always done it. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but I think you need to know why you're doing what it is you're doing and what the alternatives are and how and just how you're differing from the way either the missals or the Book of Common Prayer. Now, there's one caveat here, and that's that the final liturgical authority in a diocese is your bishop. And this is stated in canon law, canon 10.04. Subject to the provisions of these canons, each bishop shall be the liturgical authority in his own diocese, with a traditional right of jus liturgicum, if I pronounced my Latin correctly. So I don't want to get a phone call or an email from one of the bishops saying that one of you said, but Canon Schultz said we should do it this way. It's up to the bishop to decide how things are going to be done in his particular diocese. And for those of you who are deacons or lay readers, of course you have to do what your priest is saying, but again, the final liturgical authority is your bishop. And I happen to know the three diocesan bishops pretty well. Bishop Bruhl was a layman in my particular parish, and so I've known him since he was a layman, and I've known the other bishops too for a long time. So if you call him up and said, but Bishop Schultz, oh geez, no. Canon Schultz said, remember, he's the authority, not me. All right, I do want to mention a little bit of canon law. Provincial Canon Law 10.01 says that worship shall be according to the Book of Common Prayer. The 1928 version is authorized. So you are authorized to use the 1928 version of the Book of Common Prayer. Canon 10.02, missals and devotional manuals based on the Book of Common Prayer may be used, specifically the American Missal and the Anglican Missal. Priest's manual and ritual notes for directions I think I've left something out here. But anyway, you can use the Anglican Missal and the American Missal, and the priest's manual and the ritual notes can be used for directions. 10.03, the principal Sunday service is Holy Communion. If a congregation has a priest, it has to celebrate Holy Communion as the principal Sunday service. And then 10.05, except for Holy Scripture printed in the Book of Common Prayer, only the King James Version may be used for public worship. We'll go over this. We'll talk about this again later, but the Psalter in the Book of Common Prayer is not the Psalter that's from the King James Version of the Bible. It derives from the Great Bible, which predates the King James Version of the Bible. I'm going to look at one thing here, so if it looks like I'm distracted, I am. Because I thought the canon said one other thing. Canon, okay. All right, Canon 10. Okay. All right, Canon 10.02, missals and devotional manuals based on conforming to and or incorporating the services set forth in the said Book of Common Prayer, specifically the American Missal and the Anglican Missal, may be used also, provided that the Executive Committee of the Council of Bishops may, in its discretion, enumerate the permitted missals and devotional manuals. The reason I want to bring that up is that there are things that are not in the either the Book of Common Prayer or the missals or the devotional missals. Um, that you can use as long as it's, how is that phrased here, based on or conforming to the 28 Book of Common Prayer. So, for example, I have in my bookcase over here a 1965 Canadian Book of Common Prayer, and I actually use the beginning of their Ash Wednesday service for the penitential office on Ash Wednesday. When we get to that point, I'll talk about that later. And then there are priest manual and ritual notes can be used for directions. I probably will say this again, but don't become a slave to ritual notes unless you've got the number of people to be able to do a full solemn mass. If you need it, if you want to do incense and and have a crucifer and torchbearers and a deacon and a subdeacon and master of ceremonies and the whole shot, you need people to do that. Don't try to do it with less than the number of people that's required. And sometimes in ritual notes it does tell you if you don't have this person, then how to do it without that particular person. But most parishes that I know of can't do a full solemn high mass every Sunday because we just don't have the people to be able to do that. Okay. I think I've already gone over the schedule of classes. Now there's going to be a quiz every week, which I will send to you by email. It's going to be 3 or 4 questions, and it will not necessarily have any bearing on the particular lecture. For example, the first quiz has to do with which collects are said on which particular Sundays, and also some order of precedence, none of which we're going to talk about today. You can think of the first quiz as kind of a pre-quiz, so that you can see, so I can see how much you already know about the Book of Common Prayer and the order of precedence and things like that. On these particular ones, you're going to need a calendar from December 2013 and January 2014, but don't worry about that. I made copies of that, and that will be included along with the quiz. All right. Oh, and then there's a final at the end of each semester. That's going to be based upon some study guides that I'm going to send you. But again, you'll get those later. All right. Let's go over the reading list. Now, obviously, you're going to need a Book of Common Prayer, the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. I highly recommend that you find a copy of Shepherd's, the Oxford American Prayer Book Commentary. That's the basis of what I'm going to give the lectures on, and there's going to be some things that you just that I'm not going to go over, but you really should read. The other thing is that Shepherd has commentaries on the Gospel, Epistle, and Collect for each Sunday and each Holy Day, and you might find those helpful when you're getting to prepare a sermon, if you're going to be preparing sermons. At least gives you an idea of what each particular Holy Day is about. Now, I've already gotten a couple of emails that wanted to know if it had to be the 1950 edition, and the answer is no. To the best of my knowledge, Shepherd never revised this particular book. And let me see. It's the copyright is 1950, but there are multiple printings. The 5th printing is in 1955, and I have a copy of that. And the other printing, I believe, is Yeah, the sixth printing in 1959. So it doesn't matter what printing that you have as long as the copyright is the 1950. You'll also need a Churchman's Ordo calendar. At this point, I don't know which months we're going to need. This just kind of comes along as things develop, but it's part of the differences between the prayer book and the missal. And the one that comes to mind, and I think this was this past Holy Week, if I remember correctly, Good Friday was March 25th, which is the Feast of the Annunciation. And as you're going to find out, the Feast of the Annunciation, Holy Week, actually any day in Lent, has precedence over the Feast of the Annunciation, and so you have to transfer the Feast of the Annunciation, and you transfer it to the first free day. Well, the first free day is the Monday after Easter 1, as far as the prayer book is concerned. But there are other holy days. As far as the missal is concerned, I think it would be transferred to the Tuesday or the Wednesday. I'd have to actually look at the calendar to see. But again, we'll get into this later on, but there are differences on how you transfer feasts based upon the missal or the prayer book. For optional reading, I've had the History of Anglican Liturgy by Cumming. It's chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Give you a lot of background information, and can be helpful. On the Shepherd's Book, going back to that, you don't actually have to own one as long as you can have access to one. And some parish libraries will have these, and I think some parish priests would have these too. But I do know that they can be found on the internet because a couple of people have found them, and their question was just about the printing. All right, the next two, Lang and Ratzinger, are basically have to do with why it's right that we should be facing the altar during communion. And perhaps some of you have heard recently one of the Roman bishops has come out and recommended that priests celebrate facing towards the altar instead of facing towards the people. Both Lang and Ratzinger are available on Amazon and on Amazon Kindle. So if you don't want to spend money for the whole book, you can get it on Kindle. But again, these last are just optional. For a useful website, I have this justice.anglican.org. They have prayer books from all over the world and in different languages. They also have the Book of Occasional Offices, orders for Compline, different things like that. And then there's the biography. Let me see. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to point out a few books in the bibliography. On page 2, if you look down towards the bottom, there's a book by Evelyn Underhill called Worship. And it talks about both the prayer book and sacramental theology. And I highly recommend that you read that at some point. After I read it, I thought, this is one of those books that you should probably read every couple of years because it has so much good information in it. The late Archbishop Morse said that there was a time in Berkeley when you could go into any of the used bookstores and find multiple copies of Worship because it was used by all of the seminaries that are there in Berkeley. Another book is just below that, which is Walker and Bell, and it's the ritual reason why, and it tells you, the title tells you what it's about. And for example, some people at the beginning of the Benedictus or the Magnificat or the Nunc Dimittis, Lord, now let thou thy servant depart in peace. They cross themselves. Well, do you know why you do that? Well, you do it because they're gospel canticles. It's the same reason why the Holy Gospel is written in the 6th chapter of John, beginning at the 15th verse. Why some people cross themselves for that. These texts come from the Gospels, and that's why we do it. So the ritual reason why will tell you all those kind of things. And then the last one that I would recommend that you read, it's on page 4, and it's Mormon's book, and it's called The Anglican Spiritual Tradition. And what's interesting about this specifically is the prologue has the fictional story of a parish priest from 1549 to 1559, and this is from the time of the first prayer book until the time of the Elizabethan prayer book, and how the average parish priest had to go from saying Mass to Latin to English to back to Latin and then back to English. And to begin with, the vestments were allowed and then they were forbidden. And then when Mary came back and the Roman Catholic liturgy was restored in Latin, then they had to figure out how they were going to have the prayer books and investments and things like that, because a lot of that stuff had been destroyed, and then it disappeared again after Queen Elizabeth I came in. So in your bibliography, if there's anything that I would recommend, it was probably those 3 particular books, because I found them particularly interesting. Also, the Anglican Spiritual Tradition is good for ascetical theology and just what is the Anglican spiritual tradition compared to some of the other spiritual traditions. All right. Let's start then with the selective history of the Book of Common Prayer. As I said, I'm not going to go through all of this. So if you turn to page... I think I'm going to start with page 4. At section 7, which is listed 1534. I'm not going to go through the reasons for the Reformation in England. All of that is in this outline, and if you're interested in all that, you can go through that. Of course, that Henry VIII wanted an annulment from his wife Catherine of Aragon, and that the Pope didn't grant that. And so in 1534, Parliament passed a series of acts which separated the Church of England from its old attachment to the rest of Christendom, of which the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, was the acknowledged head. Thus, in a few years, the powers of the Church of Rome in England were ended. Powers which had formerly been wielded by the Pope were now used by the King and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The interesting thing is that in 1534, there were no changes to the liturgy. The Mass continued on in Latin with the same manual acts, just the same way that it had been. And it wasn't until 1538 when each parish was required to obtain a Bible in English and to set it up in the church where people could come and read. Perhaps you've seen pictures of this, or if you've been in a cathedral in England, but sometimes there's a pillar, and on the pillar there's a stand, and on the stand there's a specific term, and I can't think of, but anyway, there's a chain, and the chain is connected into the column. What would have been chained there was the Bible. A Bible in English would have been extremely expensive, and it would have been something someone would want to steal. And so they were chained in the churches so no one could steal them. Before 1538, it was a crime to have a copy of the Bible in English. So you can see that it's kind of a radical change, but when you think about it, it's not much of a change. Just you had to have a Bible in English in the church. Then in 1539, Parliament passed the Statute of the Six Articles, which was initiated by Henry VIII, and the statute showed that the king did not intend to change the religious life of the people. And so it affirmed the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. It upheld the doctrine that wasn't necessary to give the laity wine. It proposed that clergy should remain celibate, that laity should keep the vows of chastity, that there should be private masses, and that auricular confession should be practiced, in other words, penance to a priest. So this is, again, nothing much happened when Henry VIII was king with regard to the liturgy or anything like that. Then in 1547, Henry VIII died and Edward VI became king. And that year, injunctions were issued that said that the epistle and gospel were to be read in English. The Bible was to be read at Matins and Evensong, and there was an English litany developed, and then there was written a book of homilies was prescribed to be read one by one on each Sunday. At that point, the Mass was still in Latin. It's just, and I don't remember offhand if the Gospel and the Epistle and the Gospel were read in Latin and then in English, or just in English alone. I don't remember that. In 1548, there appeared what was called an Order of Communion, and it was an English form to be used in the Mass immediately before the communion of the people. And what it consisted of was the exhortation, the invitation to confession, absolution, comfortable words, prayer of humble access, words of administration, and the blessing. But again, in 1548, the rest of the service was still in Latin. The first prayer book of Edward VI appears in 1549. And normally I footnote my stuff really well, but this was written so long ago I don't have the footnote in there. But anyway, it was a genuine product of the English Reformation, untampered with by foreign reformers. It was, in its main essence, a revision and translation of the Latin breviary, missal and pontifical, according to the use of Sarum, with certain modifications and additions. There was at this time all sorts of reformed liturgies in the continent, and some of them went much farther than the Book of Common Prayer did. And so the 1549 is kind of the, the 1552 book comes along and really changes the theology of the 1549 book. And after that, from the 1559 of Queen Elizabeth I, and then on, the changes were made to bring the prayer book back more in line with the 1549 book. Okay. The first prayer book of, as I said, the prayer book was to be used from Whitsunday, June 1st, 1549, and there was a heavy fine and 6 months jail for failure to use the Book of Common Prayer. The Latin Mass was made illegal, and Latin was omitted from all services. The shape of the liturgy was the same, and Mass was celebrated in a manner not unlike that which people were familiar. Vestments were allowed. There was more dialogue between the priest and the people. And of course, they would have, those people who didn't speak Latin or understand Latin would understand the English, and so they could participate more. A sermon had to be preached or a homily read at every Mass. The chalice was administered to the laity for the first time in about 300 years. Priests were allowed to marry, and there was no private confession. The invitation and confession, general confession, being considered to be sufficient. Then in 1550, books, missals, processionals, manuals, ordinals were to be completely destroyed. And all images or statues in churches were to be defaced or destroyed. And prior to this, only images or pictures that had been abused were to be destroyed. I don't know who decided when something was being abused, but anyway, now it was every image or picture. Statues of the Virgin and other saints, roods with the crucifixion of Christ and Mary and St. John were taken down and burned as firewood. And in some churches, stained glass was removed. I remember the couple of times I've been in England, it seemed like you go into a church, and it was one, and they would point out what was not original, and it was always three things. It was pretty much always three things. It was destroyed during the time of the dissolution of the monasteries, or at the time of the Reformation, specifically, this particular time. It was destroyed during the English Civil War. There's one cathedral, and I can't remember which one it is, where the only stained glass, medieval stained glass that exists is way on the top, because the Puritans didn't have any ladders that went far enough that would allow them to remove them. And then for churches in the southern part, they were bombed during the Second World War. Of course, also, if they were in London, then the church might have been destroyed during the Great Fire. But pretty much any destruction in a church in England happened by one of those particular things. So anyway, the clergy were forbidden to burn candles in the church except for 2 on the altar. So there wouldn't be multiple candles on the altar, and there wouldn't be votive stands or things like that. And the little ceremonies were forbidden. The elevation of the host, I believe that's, after I can't start in the middle of the service of consecration, but after the words of an institution, the priest genuflects, stands up, holds up the host, and then genuflects again, and then holds up the channel. That was forbidden. The lavabo was forbidden, and the ringing of the Sanctus bell was forbidden. And then old stone altars were replaced by wooden tables. The Puritans, Presbyterian faction of the church really were into wooden tables compared to stone altars. And I think, I'm sure the idea was, and it's not a bad idea, but is that Jesus used a wooden table, and therefore we should use wooden tables. They ignored the whole history, though, that in the early church, there were no churches, and people met churches met in people's houses, but they also celebrated Mass on the tombs of the martyrs, and those were the stones were. And I believe in Roman Catholic churches today, there's supposed to be relics of a saint in an altar. But anyway, they went to wooden tables. All right, in 1552, the second book of Edward VI came out. It was the least Catholic of any of the English prayer books, bearing marks of the influence of and concessions to foreign Protestants. and in no way representing the true ideas of the English Reformation. It marks the extreme point to which the Church of England ever went in the direction of compromise with those who held un-Catholic views. The prayer book never possessed the slightest claim to ecclesiastical authority and was in use only about 8 months. Again, I'd have to look through some of my books, but I think the Convocation, which is a group of, I'm guessing it was just clergy at this time, approved the 1549 book, and it might also have been approved by Parliament, but the 1552 book wasn't approved in that way. The reason that there was the foreign influence is that there were a lot of German Protestants who had come to the country and enforced their views on, quote, the feeble and complacent Anglican hierarchy. I think you get the idea. Is basically the outside influences influenced Cranmer, and it came out with a 1552 book. Altars were placed table-wise, that is, with the narrow end towards the people, and priests were enjoined to stand at the north end of the altar. Actually, they were standing in the middle of the altar. It's just that the altar was turned sideways, and that's why I have my little direction here. At the time of Archbishop Laud, and he was Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633 and 1640, the altars were returned to their north-south orientation, but the rubric for the priest to stand at the north end of the altar wasn't changed. If you've seen a reenactment of an American liturgy from 1789, the priest stands at the side, at the north end, and the reason they did that is because the rubric that said to stand in the middle wasn't changed, and the rubric still said stand on the north end. And of course, when the time, actually I don't think it's so much the Oxford movement as later, as the more ritualistic movement, and priests moved to the center of the altar. There was a lot of controversy about that. All right. No vestments were allowed. No sign of the cross when the priest consecrated the bread and wine. You cannot tell the people that a person that he was going to, the priest could not tell the people that he was giving them the body and blood of Christ. You cannot use a christening robe, and you cannot anoint a dying man. So these were things that couldn't be done in under the 1552 prayer book. And of course, some of those then just were never revived until, again, after the Oxford movement and again the more ritualistic movement. All right, in 1553, Edward VI died, and Mary I becomes queen. First thing she does is forbids preaching. There was an act that repealed many of the acts laid down by Edward VI, and after December 20th, all services were returned to the form used in the last year of Henry VIII, 1547. And since Henry VIII didn't make any changes, it was back to the Latin Mass. So all that had been done in the last 6 years had been swept away. But there was a problem, and this comes out in Mormon's prologue. All the old books were to have been destroyed. Now, of course, not all of them were, but enough of them were destroyed that the clergy didn't have these books. Altars had been broken, stone altars had been broken. The vestments had been sold. They'd gotten rid of the crosses and the candlesticks. So they had to scramble around to find those things. And it's known that one of the things they did for vestments was to take draperies out of some of the English country houses and make those into drapes. Okay. Also, heretics were burned at the stake. Cranmer was burned at the stake. Lattimore, Ridley, and there's another one, his name I can't remember, were all burned at the stake. But then in 1558, Mary died, and Elizabeth I becomes queen. The prayer book of Elizabeth I in 1559. In this book, many of the imperfect features of the book of 1552 were remedied. The ornaments of the church and of the ministers, legalized in the second year of Edward VI, were authorized in Elizabeth's prayer book, and directions were given to furnish churches and chancels as they had been in the closing years of the reign of Henry VIII. So it went back more to what the service would have been. The service would have been under the 1549 book, but also with the vestments and things from the time of Henry VIII. There was also an act of supremacy and an act of uniformity. The act of supremacy states that Elizabeth I is the head of the church. The act of uniformity is that everybody has to use the Book of Common Prayer, no exceptions. But the thing that this meant was that the English would no longer recognize the jurisdiction of the papacy. That was over. They weren't going to go back. But in 4 times in 10 years, the form of worship had changed. And you can imagine, if you've ever been in a parish where the priest retired or left for some reason, and the new person came in and did things slightly differently, then you know, it takes a while to get used to the way the new person does it. Well, imagine in 10 years having 10 different priests doing things 10 different ways. You can imagine what chaos that would kind of bring about. All right. The next Book of Common Prayer, let me just check something here. Okay. The next Book of Common Prayer is the Prayer Book of James I in 1604. Some trifling improvements specifically to the calendar were made in this book. The demands of the Puritans involving a drastic recasting in the Book of Common Prayer was steadfastly refused. And then the prayer book was again changed in 1662 after the Restoration. The present prayer book, which approaches, and this is the present prayer book, approaches in excellence most nearly of all intermediate revisions to the first book of Edward VIII. So that's a brief history of the changes of the Book of Common Prayer in England. Gotta go through my notes here. 1549. Okay. This then brings us to the. Okay. Now I'm going to finish this up. It'll take a little bit longer, but I'm going to finish this up. This brings us then to the United States. Now, in 1607, Jamestown was founded, and in the colonies, in some colonies the churches were established, and other colonies not. But Virginia is one of the colonies where the church was established. Then we're going to skip to 1783 after the American Revolution. Samuel Seabury was elected the Bishop of Connecticut, and he went to England and stayed there for a year. He wasn't ordained in the English church because at that time the bishop had to swear an oath of allegiance to the crown, and by then the United States was a separate country and they couldn't do that. And until there was an act of Parliament that changed that, they would have still had to have this allegiance. The reason that Parliament didn't do that was there was a feeling that the Americans didn't want bishops. But anyway, so he was elected. Then he went to Scotland. Now, there were 2 Scottish Episcopal communions. One was in communion with the Church of England, and the other one was called the Non-Jurors. I think you need to know something about the non-jurors. They were in good standing according to canon law. There was no problem with their orders or anything like that. Their only disability was on the civil side of the law. And what had happened is when James II had been overthrown by William and Mary, the non-jurors refused to take an oath of allegiance to James II because he was still living, and they had taken an oath, and therefore they felt they were bound by their allegiance to their oath to James II. I've always found this kind of interesting because James II was a Roman Catholic, so the Church of England clergy swore allegiance to him as the king and wouldn't swear allegiance to William and Mary, even though they were the Protestant king and queen. For that, many of the non-jurors were lost their positions in the Church of England. But in Scotland, they seem to have divided up into two churches, and so he goes to the non-jurors. He was consecrated in 1784 by the bishop of by the primus of the Scottish non-jurors, and the bishop of Aberdeen, the bishop of Ross and Moray, and the bishop coadjutor of Aberdeen. In return for being consecrated by them, they requested that Seabury endeavor to persuade the church in America to adopt the communion office of the non-jurors. This was a return to the prayer book of 1549. Yeah, this has nothing to do really with anything we're going to talk about. But I know some of the other continuing Anglican churches use the 1662 prayer book, and there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, it is what's authorized in England. But the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, which is certainly a legitimate prayer book, is more like the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. And I don't see why they use the 1662. I don't like it as well myself, but that's me. Okay, and next, William White was elected Bishop of Pennsylvania, and Provost was elected Bishop of New York. They were consecrated in 1787 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of York, and the Bishop of Bath and Wells. In 1790, James Madison, not the president, and my understanding not related to the president, was consecrated Bishop of Virginia in England by the Bishop of London, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Bishop of Rochester. Then in 1792, Thomas John Claggett was consecrated in New York City by the Bishop of Maryland, as Bishop of Maryland by Seabury, White, Provost, and Madison. He was the first bishop consecrated in the United States, and in Claggett, he unites the English and Scottish lines of apostolic succession. Everyone after him was either consecrated by him, Claggett, or consecrated by somebody that was consecrated by Claggett. Also, it's interesting, Bishop White was still consecrating bishops as late as, I think it's 1820. He lived quite a long life. In the 1800s, we have the Oxford movement. And so that brings us to the end of our selective history of the Book of Common Prayer, of the Church of England. But I do want to go over some of these quotes here. And they're from different periods of time. In 1562, John Jewel, the Bishop of Salisbury, and this is the time of Elizabeth I. We have returned to the apostles and the old Catholic fathers. We have planted no new religion, but only preserved the old that was undoubtedly founded and used by the apostles of Christ and other holy fathers of the primitive church. Let's see. Elizabeth I herself wrote, "We and all our people, thanks be to God, follow no novel or strange religions, but the very religion which is ordained by Christ, sanctioned by the primitive and Catholic Church, and proved by the consistent mind and voice of the most early fathers. And then in 1569, Elizabeth I also wrote, "We deny to claim any superiority to ourself to define, decide, or determine any article or point of the Christian faith and religion, or to change any ancient ceremony of the Church from the form before received and observed by the Catholic and Apostolic Church." This, of course, gets to the heart of doctrine and what can be changed and what can't be changed. Bishop John Cozen, in the mid-1660s, wrote, "In truth, we have continued the old religion and the ceremonies which we have taken from them that were before us are not." I guess I can't read. "In truth, we have continued the old religion and the ceremonies which we have taken from them that were before us are not things that belong to this or that sect, but they are the ancient rites and customs of the Church of Christ, whereof ourselves being part, we have the self-same interest in them, which our fathers before us had, from whom the same descended unto us." He also wrote, "The Church of England has not abrogated any ceremonies that were instituted by Christ or his apostles, were generally received by the whole Church." Thomas Ken, one of my favorite bishops of the Church of England and a non-juror, wrote, "We possess the Holy Catholic and Apostolic faith possessed by the whole Church before the disunion of East and West, more particularly as professed by the Church of England as it stands distinguished from all papal and Puritan innovations, and as it adheres to the doctrine of the cross." You have all sung Thomas Ken, because he is the one in the poem has the line, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." And then Geoffrey Fisher, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1945 to 1961, "We have no doctrine of our own. We only possess the Catholic doctrine of the Catholic Church enshrined in the Catholic creeds. And these creeds we hold without addition or diminution. We stand firm on that rock." Okay, so we've gone through the selective history, brief outline of the history of, selective outline of the history of the Church of England. I deliberately ended with the Oxford movement. Obviously, things have changed in the Church of England since then. There was an attempt made to change the prayer book in 1928, excuse me, but that failed. And then, because Parliament wouldn't agree to it, and then they decided, well, if we can't get Parliament to agree, we'll come out what were called the alternative service books. So they have all sorts of different things that can be done in the Church of England today, but the 1662 is still the authorized version. I think that's it. I will, let me see here. Okay. Okay. All right. So I did. So we have gone through the selective outline. The next thing I'm going to talk about, and we'll start that next week, is the brief history of the Book of Common Prayer. I wanted to get that in today, but I talked too long. So hopefully I will be able to get this uploaded to YouTube this afternoon, and I will have sent out an email to you. Look forward to seeing you in the next class. The questions, I'm going to ask that you return them to me by October 4th. However, on October 4th, I'm going to be in Raleigh with a Board of Examining Chaplains meeting, so I won't get them graded until I get back. I'm also going to do the second lecture before and send that out before I go to Raleigh, and so I will not be able to go over those quizzes with you. But before the third lecture, I should be able to go over the quizzes with you for both the first and second quizzes. What I will do is I'll grade your quiz, send you an email back, and then if there's something that everybody misses, or if there's some things people are confused about, and I'm sure there will be, especially with the first one, then I'll go over that with the whole class, so you know what the correct answer is. So everybody will know what the correct answer is. So I think that's it. Until next time, may God bless you, and I'll see you the next time.